Hello, everyone, and welcome to Future Food Perspectives. Now, we're having a panel discussion here today as part of National Science Week, and this panel's been organised by the ACT, National Science Week Committee. If you have some questions as we go along, I'll try and remind you, but if you could pop them in the Q&A section, we'll be monitoring that. And if there's a suitable time as we go along, we'll be answering those questions, and we'll certainly have lots of time for questions at the end. So today, when we think about the future of food, I mean, the great thing about food is we all eat it. It's a bit like education. We all have an opinion because we all got some kind of education. So food, we all eat it. But when we think about the future of food, certainly if we look back in time, it's changed a lot. And so there's no reason to doubt that food going forward is going to change a lot too. And there's lots of different ways that we can approach this discussion. And we'll be talking around a few of those points of view tonight with our panelists. We've brought together some world-leading experts and researchers tonight, and I'm going to introduce them to you now. First up, we have Dr. Trang Ta, and her name is Ta. We like to call her Ta, and she's a cultural and medical anthropologist from the School of Archaeology and Anthropology at ANU, the Australian National University. Welcome, Ta.
Hi, Ingrid. Hi, everybody.
Ta, can you explain for us what a cultural and medical anthropologist does?
Well, basically what we do as anthropologists is we study human societies, contemporary human societies. So unlike our archaeologists who actually study past societies, and medical anthropology as a subdiscipline within anthropology is actually quite broad. So it straddles both all the way from, the physical, biological sciences all the way to the cultural and cultural studies and humanities. So as a cultural and medical anthropologist, I'm really interested in the philosophies and the different healing systems around the world.
Okay, sounds really, really interesting. I'm sure that you're going to bring a really unique insight into food for us here tonight. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got to be a cultural and medical anthropologist? How did you get working at the ANU? How did you get here?
Well, I'm not from Australia, so I think you can sort of tell from my accent. Since when I moved here, everyone's just like, "Are you Canadian?" And I was like, "Well, sort of." But so I was born in Vietnam, but I was raised in the United States, and I've lived all over Asia. So just by my own personal experience, I think I was sort of meant to be an anthropologist. So I still do a lot of traveling. Well, before the borders shut down, obviously. But yeah, so I grew up loving food because you can tell I'm Asian. And so I think Asians tend to really love their food. And having lived all over Asia, I've grown very familiar with all the different cuisines. But also just growing up, I think you get socialized by sort of your cultural background. And, when I was growing up, my parents taught me that, food actually is not just nutrition, but it's actually medicinal, right? And so you just grow up learning that certain foods have cooling or heating properties. I mean, this is a part of, Chinese medicine. So.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. Okay, all right. So our next speaker is Dr. TJ Higgins, and he is an honorary fellow at CSIRO. Welcome, TJ.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Okay, so honorary fellow could mean anything. What do you study at CSIRO?
Well, I started out with an agricultural science degree in Ireland a long time ago. And then I went to California, to the University of California, to do a PhD. From there, I moved to ANU as a postdoctoral fellow. And from there, I then went to CSIRO, which is where I've been ever since. I'm now retired, but I still work in the lab, and I'm still doing plant science.
Fantastic. All right. And how did you come? Well, we sort of talked a little bit about that. What are the most interesting things you think you've done some research on?
Well, research is always interesting, always very challenging. Things don't go as you might expect. But I think probably the most interesting and challenging research is the work that I've been involved in over the last 15 years or so, when I have been using some of the techniques that I used when I was working full time, things that I learned, so that I could now transfer some of those about the time I started to retire. So I could transfer some of those things to Africa, to places that didn't have quite access to the same sorts of technology that I had. That, I think, has been the most interesting and challenging, because it covered everything from doing science in the lab to working with intellectual property people, working with social scientists, and working with farmers in a very different environment to what we would normally associate with farming in Australia. Farmers in the parts of Africa that I work are much smaller farmers, smallholders, I mean. They're not shorter, they're full size, but they are smallholder farmers. They might have a hectare of land, not an average of 3,000 or 4,000 hectares. So it's very different kind of agriculture to what we would experience here and what I experienced in the early part of my career.
I think that's fascinating that, there's always something new to learn and a different way to apply what you've learned as well. That's fantastic. Okay, and finally, but not lastly, is Dr. Emma Beckett, and she is a molecular nutritionist, I'll get it right, from the University of Newcastle. Now, Emma, what would be the difference between a molecular nutritionist and, say, just like your regular garden variety nutritionist?
So I call myself a molecular nutritionist basically because I don't want people asking me questions like, how do I lose weight? Or what do I eat to make gains at the gym? Or how do I eat to get glowy skin or beautiful hair? They're not the kinds of things that interest me in nutrition. The things that interest me in nutrition are really at that nitty-gritty molecular basis, and how does food interact with our bodies in both directions. So I'm interested in things like, how does food switch genes on and off, or how do the genes that we have as individuals change the way that we respond to food? So why do some of us taste different foods differently, or why do some of us eat a healthy diet all our lives and still get lifestyle diseases, or why can some of us avoid lifestyle diseases even though we've probably not done all the things that are recommended with our diets? So I'm interested in really that you are what you eat at a molecular basis, but also how you are changes what you eat and how you respond to food.
I think we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. I find it fascinating. How did you become a molecular nutritionist?
It was a super long road for me to end up here. I think I ended up working in genetics and nutrition, partly because I'm an identical twin, and I have 9 brothers and sisters. So I knew what genetics was before I knew the word for it, because I'd seen those similarities in me and my identical twin being genetically identical, and the similarities and differences between us and all of our siblings. So that's probably how I ended up here, but it was a very long road for me to get here. I started out thinking I was going to be a lawyer, studied law at university, then realized that what I thought was cool about law, looking at evidence and figuring out the truth, was actually what scientists did, not what lawyers did. So after a whole bunch of different science degrees, I realized what you said at the start, we all eat food. And I realized that because everyone eats food every day, food science and human nutrition is one of those caring professions where you can make discoveries to make a difference in everyone's lives. So I ended up here as my science of choice through that kind of inspiration, I guess.
Fantastic. All right. Okay, so we're going to get into some of the discussion topics now. And I want to sort of base our discussion around some themes. So let's talk firstly, very broadly, about food production. So I think sometimes we don't think about food as a production line, or, where does our food come from? And some interesting facts when I was doing some research for this talk. By 2050, So that's, you know, what, less than 30 years away. The world's population is expected to reach around 9.6 billion people. And so the demand for food is increasing by 14% each decade. And we're going to consume as much food in those next 4 decades as we have consumed in the previous few hundred years. Now that's insane growth in, you know, I think we all understand exponential growth now after the year we've had. That's a massive increase in the amount of food that we're going to need to produce to feed everybody. That's 70% increase. So Tar, I'm going to start with you. Can you talk to us about what are some of the ways that we're changing agribusiness and, you know, the way we produce food to meet the huge current, like we've got the current demand for food is huge, but going forward, we can see that it's going to increase and we've got a growing population. And a bigger percentage of that population will become middle class incomes and they're demanding higher quality food. What sorts of things do you see as changing to meet that demand?
Well, I can sort of speak about the case of China, because what I didn't mention in the introduction is that I work in China, Singapore and Hong Kong as well. So I remember going to China and we would go into the countryside, and just over even like the past 20 years, right? I think TJ was talking about sort of like small landholding farmers, you know, I mean, there was a lot of small landholding farmers, you know, before, you know, the founding of the People's Republic of China, right? And then you had the rise of these communes. And now what you have is you have a lot of industrialized agriculture in China, incredibly high-tech industrialized agriculture. So you have the growth of agribusiness in China, and that's because it's responding to, you were saying, the growth of the middle class. The growth of the Chinese middle class, you can sort of see it in consumption levels, right? The rise of luxury goods, sort of coming into China, but just the fact that they are just consuming more, even though they've had the one-child policy, and now they've sort of loosened the one-child policy and they can have more children, up to 3 in some areas. Ethnic minorities in China have always, you know, could always have more than one child. And so, but I remember going to China, because I've been going for the past 20 years, and every year, and you sort of see the changes in terms of the countryside, the industrialization. But I remember seeing the interest in organic foods, because as the middle class in China grows, they're also interested in consuming organic foods. And I remember going into, you know, Sichuan province, which is southwest China, and these vast fields of, you know, growing organic foods for Walmart, for example, right? Wow. And so I don't know, you guys don't have Walmart in Australia, but Walmart is, you know, one of the biggest sort of, you know, chain stores, yeah, in the US, but they actually have Walmart in China as well. And so you have to ask, you know, where is all of this sort of production and labor coming from, right? It's because it's technology, right? Agribusiness technology. At the same time, you still have these sort of like, you know, artisanal organic farmers who are actually producing, you know, high value organic foods for these, you know, upper middle class Chinese, because upper middle class Chinese, as you're aware, I mean, they're very concerned about their health, right? That's why they were buying, for example, you know, formula, right? Foreign formula. There's a whole sort of, you know, scandal that came out, sort of adulterated formula. So the Chinese middle class is actually concerned about adulterated foods. They really want high quality, nutritious foods. And you can sort of see the, you know, the trade between Australia and China, right? Until recently, you know, how much demand there was for Australian produce, Australian goods going into China. So you're right that the Chinese middle class are eating more and they're eating higher quality foods. And this has environmental consequences.
And so, like, if we've gone from a situation when there was like small little fields to communes to tell someone who's watching tonight what an industrialized farm would look like.
It would be much more high tech than you would imagine, right? It's not this sort of bucolic scene. It's not a bucolic landscape in any way. So you have a lot of sort of machinery, you've got irrigation systems in place, you've got, you know, harvesting, you know, combines, all of that's in place, right? So it's not that sort of bucolic scene that you would imagine. So it's not romanticized in any ways. It's highly mechanized and very technological, and everything's sort of timed and measured.
Yeah, I mean, and from the little I know of Australian agriculture is going much the same way. TJ, do you know much about the Australian agricultural scene?
Yes, the Australian agricultural scene is very much as Ta has described it. It's highly technological. Australian farmers, there's 130,000 of them altogether in Australia. They are, you know, paying attention to advances in genetics and agronomy. They're highly educated, and they're very aware of all the issues that you brought up. I mean, they produce enough food to feed 60 or more million people now, you know, more than double the Australian population.
Right.
So from an Australian perspective, as you said before, there is very little prospect that even in 30 years' time that Australia will be suffering greatly from food insecurity. In fact, it won't happen in Australia probably, but it will happen elsewhere in the world. Mm. As Taz just mentioned, in Asia, but also in Africa, which currently has over 1 billion people as well. But the population in Africa is going to get very much greater over the next 30 years. And it's in places like that that I think we have to worry about, are we going to be able to produce enough food to feed those people? And if I could just say now, in answer to your earlier question, would we be able to produce enough food? I think we will be able to produce enough food. The problem is, what is going to be the environmental cost? Mm-hmm. You know, are we going to have to clear all of the Amazon to produce food? We cannot afford to do that. We have to change the way in which we produce food into the future. I think we've used up just about as much arable land as we can, you know, really justify having used.
Yeah, yep. And we will talk a little bit more about environmental impact of food production. But I guess in terms of, you know, some of the newer technologies, we need to talk to you, TJ, about genetically modified foods. We can't keep, you know, clearing land and producing food either by livestock or growing things in the same way. What difference is genetically modified foods going to have for our food production? Can we manage without them?
Could we manage without GM?
Yeah.
Genetic modification? Oh, yes, we could manage without GM. Even now, genetically modified crops really are only less than 10% of the world cropping area. So it's still a minor player. And when people make statements like, you know, you absolutely need genetic modification in order to feed the world, my reaction as a genetic engineer is that that's crazy stuff. Genetic modification technologies are, I think, useful, but they're not the whole thing. There's so many other techniques in genetics that modern plant breeders are using. Genetic modification is just one of them. It is useful in its context, but it's not going to feed the world by itself. What we are going to do to feed the world is to use the best genetics and the best agronomy together. You know, good management by farmers in the field, as well as good genetics by people working in the lab, whether they're, you know, very traditional plant breeders or more modern plant breeders who don't use GM techniques. We just need to get the package right. Use genetic modification where it's appropriate, but really concentrate on good genetics and good agronomy.
So we have some interesting questions that are related to this from the audience, and I'll throw it open and I'll get to you in a minute. We've got some specific ones here for you, Emma. But what about aquaponics as a means for increasing production? Is that something that anyone's had experience in?
You mean like hydroponics?
Hydroponics,
Yes,
without soil.
Without soil. Yes, well, that technology has been in use for a very long time. It's used to grow tomatoes in Holland, for instance, or in Ireland, places like that. It has a limited possibility. It is useful in its context as well, but it's probably a relatively minor player when you think about feeding 9 to 10 billion people. But it has some advantages in the right place. But it's a bit like genetic modification. Like I said about genetic modification, it is just a component of the whole system, a small one, but important in its context.
Mm. Tara, I think you've had some experience with some, I don't know, hydroponics or some, what do they call it? It's in a vertical farming, they call it. That's the word I'm trying to think of, vertical farming. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, I was thinking about Singapore because, there's, for places like Singapore, Hong Kong, right? I mean, Singapore gets a lot of, its food products coming in from Malaysia, right? Same thing with Hong Kong. It's getting a lot of its food coming in from mainland China. I mean, these are two very heavily populated, places. And so they are forced, they also have the resources too, right? Because they're much wealthier places, but they're forced to really engage in much more experimental farming techniques. So you get vertical farming, you get hydroponics, right? Because there isn't that land space, because that land is actually quite valuable and it's used for, other purposes, right? And so you've got the vertical farming, which is incredibly technology intensive. So you really do need the resources. You need the kind of technicians, right, that can actually sort of monitor the growth. And I think, as TJ says, it's not the answer to feeding the population, right? I mean, Singapore is not feeding itself through vertical farms or through hydroponics, right? It's actually a very sort of niche industry still, and what does get produced is actually much more expensive than, for example, some of the stuff that comes in from Malaysia, right?
But it is interesting, Tao, because it makes people aware of where their food comes from as well. It makes people more aware of the labor involved in producing food as well. So that's, a really positive aspect of people looking at that kind of way of producing food.
Oh, I completely agree with you. I think this awareness and the fact that, the labor conditions on traditional farms is actually quite severe, right? I mean, I come from the United States. And so, the US agriculture industry relies on migrant labor. So if we did not have that, migrant labor from Mexico, for example, we wouldn't have the cheap food that we have access to, right? And I think there's a crisis now in Australia, right, that there isn't enough laborers to actually work on the farm. So you can sort of see that sort of interdependence and that reliance on labor.
That's a really interesting point. Emma, I just want to pop to you for a minute. So we're talking about this mass production of food, and very often it's things like rice and bread and grains and things like that. So there's a couple of things that we can look at there. One thing I want to ask you about is nutrients. So are we able to provide, these mass produced, the cheap foods, for instance, in the United States are generally pretty poor nutrient density. How are we going to be able to give people food that's going to make them healthy, but they can afford to eat?
So I guess to start answering that, the first thing I want to say is I don't want to demonize those foods. Those foods are accessible, they're shelf stable, they're a way that people get the energy that they need and survive when they can't access fresh or whole foods. And without the mass-produced nutrient-poor foods, a lot of us wouldn't have survived and we wouldn't all be here. So I don't want it to get into demonizing one kind of food product versus versus another. But there is a trend towards what we call functional foods, where we take those processed foods and add ingredients in to make what people are already eating a more healthful product. And sometimes that's great. Sometimes it's doing things like adding plant sterols so that an everyday product can help lower people's blood cholesterol. Sometimes it's things like bread. Our bread in Australia is fortified with iodine and folate because most of us don't eat enough of those, and they're very important. And so the government said, everyone mostly eats bread, let's pop these nutrients in there. So sometimes there's really, really good evidence for it, and there is a good benefit. But sometimes it's things like, adding antioxidants to a chocolate bar and calling that a functional food when there's not really good evidence that those extra antioxidants are the ones that we were missing and needed more of. So you really need to take those added components, or the products with the added components, on a case-by-case basis, and sometimes with a grain of salt. And often what those functional foods do when they're things like extra antioxidants is it makes the product more expensive, and sometimes that can be a distraction from what we want people to do is eat more fresh whole food, because your regular fruit and veg are full of antioxidants. But it's a bit of a trade-off, I guess, in kind of trying to make them accessible and making them attractive. But when we take those things out of their natural food environment, we lose the food matrix. So when food grows, those nutrients come in a package with other nutrients, and that affects the way they're absorbed and the way that they're used. So if you just go throwing them into junk foods, for want of a better term, it's probably not giving us the maximum benefit because we're missing out on everything else. So there is also a trend now, or a future trend, towards what we call biofortification, where we're breeding foods to have more of those good things in them, whether it's through GM or through traditional breeding methods. So that way the extra nutrients are in that food matrix already, and we're encouraging people to eat fresh whole foods rather than processed foods with healthful properties added.
And so, kind of maybe related to that, in the questions, we've got a question about whether moving to a plant-based diet is a good thing. There's discussions about that and pros and cons. So what, in your professional opinion, is it generally a good thing to be focusing more on eating plants than
So it depends on how you do it. So if you eat a plant-based diet by eating more whole grains and more fruit and vegetables, then great. That is an excellent way to improve your diet. That's getting more of our 5 core food groups. If you're going to plant-based and what you're looking for is a plant-based mimicry of something else, and it's a hyper-processed version of those plants, then you're probably not doing yourself the same good. And a lot of those really hyper-processed plant-based patties and those kinds of products are leveraging off the back of research that says eating a plant-based diet is good for you. But that research is not on eating a plant-based diet that's been processed into a patty. It's on eating whole fruit, veg, and whole grains. If you want to talk about plant-based, sugar is plant-based. Potato chips are plant-based. I don't think any of us believe those are a health food. So it depends on what the final product is and how we're eating it that really matters, rather than just saying plant-based as a catch-all.
Right, because there very much seems like, I just noticed in the supermarket, there's more and more things that look like something else, but that they're plant-based, so they must be good for you.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of research that still needs to be done to really nut out what the health benefits are of those and what they're displacing in the diet. So are people eating less actual fruit and veg because they're choosing plant-based patties, or are they displacing high saturated fat diets? Or some of those products will add saturated fats in to make them feel more like meat-based products, which means you're really just back where you started.
Yeah. Okay, all right. So I'm just having a quick check of, now here's one that might be quite interesting. So we touched briefly on genetically modified foods and whether or not we are going to need them to feed all these people. But someone's written here a question. There seems to be a fear of genetically modified, what's the O?
Organism.
Organism. Oh, interesting. But you're really eating food, aren't you? You're not eating genetically modified food, let's call it that. It says in the USA, but I would argue that perhaps in Australia as well. Why is that, do you think? And what can is it founded in any kind of reality?
Well, it's not, I should probably address that. It's not really founded in any kind of reality. It is founded on fear. You know, there have been very effective groups out there demonizing genetic modification, not because I think initially, certainly not because the food was thought to be dangerous at the beginning, but probably more to do with the way in which the multinational corporations were involved in making genetically modified plants. They had the resources to do it, and people were concerned about them taking over the whole food chain. That really is probably one of the major reasons for why people are so upset about GM. The World Health Organization says, you know, food made from GM plants is as safe as food made from any other plant. So the argument is a little bit like the anti-vaccination argument or the people who deny climate change. If you listen to the science, you'll find out that GM plants and the food made from them is just as safe as it is from anything else. So that's a terrible situation that we're in. There are people who are concerned about this, and they shouldn't be concerned about it, really.
Ta, how are GMs viewed in China? What's the viewpoint of that, particularly maybe some of these increasing income population in China?
Well, actually, can I just sort of say something about, I think sort of to piggyback on what TJ was saying. Look, I think it's natural, I think, for humans to be suspicious of the unknown, right? Because, you know, especially people who are not familiar with, you know, the mechanisms that go into the engineering because they don't have engineering degrees, but also what TJ was saying too, this sort of suspicion over the fact that these elites with these resources, right, these multinational corporations, they're the ones in control of this knowledge. And so you have a lot of people sort of concerned about that. I think rightly so. They should be concerned, right? Because what we have not addressed is the fact that there's a lot of structural inequities in the world, right? There's the fact that, yes, we have plenty of food in Australia, but, you know, we still have hunger. So how do you account for that? How do you explain that? Okay. So you've got, you know, we can talk about the third world out there, right, in these sort of developing countries, but you have the third world right in the inner city. You know, I work in Hong Kong, for example, and Hong Kong was one of the most sophisticated cosmopolitan, you know, global cities in the world. But I work with the elderly working poor who themselves can't even secure enough for their daily, you know, food intake, right? And then you have to ask the question, well, why is it that you can find poverty and marginalization and vulnerability everywhere in the world? So, you know, a lot of this critique that comes from, you know, okay, why do we still have malnutrition? Why do we still have hunger? So is it because we haven't produced enough food? Well, we clearly are producing a lot of food, right? We have lots of options to produce food, but maybe the question is a much deeper question about, well, where's the political will to make sure that everyone gets fed, right? Where are the political structures in place to ensure that there is equitable and just distribution of food? And I think, you know, when people, especially who are incredibly marginalized and vulnerable, they see the inequities, right? They live the inequities every single day. You know, we have the privilege to choose a plant-based diet or, you know, another kind of diet, right? Because that's a privilege, right? Where we choose not to eat. But a lot of, you know, people in the world actually have a vegetarian diet, and that's because that's just part of the life that they live in. That's the environment, right? So, look, I think as an anthropologist, you know, I'm very attentive to the fact that people come from very different worlds. They see the world from very different perspectives. I think if you come from a perspective where you have faith and belief in science, and so you might not share the same suspicion as others who might not have that education, right? Who might not have that access. And what they see is the world around them, their lived experience, and their lived experience is like a lot of structural violence and a lot of inequity. And so they are concerned about multinational corporations who take control of the market, right? Who take control of all these resources, and who take control of seeds, for example, and all of, and you know, all these inputs, right? They see themselves being pushed out off of the land. They see agribusiness growing. So so I think as an anthropologist, I just want us to be attentive to the fact that, yeah, people come at it from very different perspective, you know, and I think it's healthy to have a discussion and debate, but also sort of being very attentive to the fact that not everyone has access to this debate, you know, and to not just sort of discount those suspicions and those fears, because they are valid for people who actually do live in fear, right? That their livelihoods are disappearing right before their eyes. Sorry, I know there's a bit of a maybe a detour, but I just want to sort of put that on the table.
But it's a good detour, and I think we touched on that when we're talking to Emma and about that, you know, access to nutritious food, and it is about, you know, realizing that people will eat what they can get to, and it's a systemic issue, not you know, a choice necessarily. Yeah, so I think they're good points. Okay, so I want to move on to a little bit more about the environmental impacts of our food and the sustainability of our food production, because in the past and certainly going forward, we're going to have, some of it might be at a significant cost to the environment. And I guess, you know, with that IPCC report coming out this week, you know, our planet and our future it's at risk for if we keep doing things the way we keep doing them. So Tara, I want to talk to you about the some of the different products that's coming out. So we've touched on that already. So some of the meat substitutes like corn, aquaculture is a really interesting topic, I think, for Asia and also Australia, and the impacts that intensive aquaculture is having on the aquatic environment. Can you talk to us about some of the costs involved, the environmental costs of the way that we're mass producing food?
Yeah, let me start with like a little bit of sort of, I guess, a couple of recipes, because just to sort of show the fact that, look, you know, I think we do need to sort of change our tastes. We do need to sort of change our appetite for certain foods. For example, you know, I grew up eating a lot of seaweed and kelp, okay? And so that is actually quite sustainable, right? There's lots of it. So that would actually, you know, help with all the overfishing that happens, right? You know, if you ever go to a Chinese banquet, right, what you'll get in terms of the cold, there's always like cold dishes, hot dishes, soups, all of these sort of, but one of the entrees is just cold sliced jellyfish, right? So there's, you know, lots of jellyfish. So basically, you know, it depends on what you grow up with, what you grow accustomed to, right? And I remember listening to a podcast all about how kelp and seaweed was actually incorporated into the native diet for, you know, the Scottish and the Irish as well, you know, but you don't sort of hear about that, right? So there's all of these sort of lost heritage foods. And so the reason I want to sort of start with that is because I think there is a lot of these foods that are much more sustainable. And if we can sort of, you know, sort of maybe revisit those foods, then we can sort of avoid some of that overfishing, because it is leading to a lot of environmental degradation if we continue to eat a highly industrialized diet. I think TJ mentioned this earlier, you know, we cannot continue to cut down the Amazon, for example, right? And grow more soy. The fact that Brazil, you know, is growing its cattle industry, right? And it's cutting down the Amazon, it's growing soy is being fed to the cows. So that conversion does not make sense, right? You're cutting down all of this forest to produce soy, to give it to these cows, right? To produce beef, and for what percentage of the population can actually eat that beef. So as I was saying before, you know, a lot of sort of people around the world, you know, they live on a vegetarian diet because that is what they can afford, right? That is what's most sustainable. You know, we are fortunate that we live in a society where we have lots of options and choices now, right? So you can sort of see the rise of plant-based foods as sort of one solution, right? Or more plant-based diets as one solution to sort of cutting down those environmental costs. But I think as an anthropologist, what I would sort of like to suggest is that I think we need to sort of think about the fact that there actually is a lot of food available out there, and we don't actually have to engage and eat or consume all that stuff that's actually sold to us, right? Because there's a lot of food that is sold to us. I mean, you walk into a modern grocery store, right? That is pure marketing, you know? And so I think we need to be more self-conscious and actually sort of be more historically aware too, that there are lots of different options that are much more sustainable than what is industrially produced and sort of offered to us as like the easiest, most convenient, most efficient choice, because those choices tend to have massive environmental consequences, which I'm sure TJ can talk about as well.
Yes, there are 3,000 edible plants out there, but probably only 300 are really eaten at all by modern societies. And probably 95% of our food comes from about 12 or 15 different plants. So there's tremendous variety out there. So it's, there's lots and lots of options for us. We shouldn't be relying on so few crops, I think.
TJ, can you also perhaps tell us a little bit about some other technologies that are being developed in agriculture that's going to help us minimise? I know that CSIRO are doing a lot of work on agricultural techniques, and what are some of the leading things that we're doing, like saving water or lowering carbon emissions or less wastage? What sorts of things stand out to you as being the leading technologies?
Well, farmers certainly have adopted a lot of new technologies, for instance, in Australia over the last 30 or 40 years. They're now much more efficient in the way in which they use water. They're much more attuned into how important the water supply really is and how limited it is really. So they are much more efficient in the way in which they use it. But there are lots of, we alluded to advances in genetics that are important in making plants more efficient from a genetic perspective. But not only are genetics important, but I also mentioned the fact that agronomy is at least equally important. Good agronomy, the way in which farmers manage those good genetics, is equally important. And that has changed dramatically over the last 40 or 50 years as well. We've talked about new technologies for mechanization. This has changed dramatically in places like Australia. Not so much so in Africa. People still have very little access to mechanization, or even, simple motorized harvesting vehicles are not available, but would have a huge impact if they were. So there are fantastic advances being made in advanced economies, as you might call them, but there's still tremendous scope for improvement elsewhere in the world as well. So there are very good farmers everywhere. It just depends on what they have access to.
And I guess that comes back to Tar's point, isn't it? That, we can look at I tend to think of agriculture through a very Australian lens, but, we're not everywhere's the same, is it? No. Emma, so I've got a question here from the audience, and it's sort of related. If there's any evidence that modern food production or processing might have had an effect on the increase in allergies or pathologies. So, you know, we're getting a lot of people now with asthma and skin conditions and things. What do we think might be causing that? Is it related to the food that we eat?
So the biggest way that modern food supply and processing will have linked to a rise in allergies is more of a survive now. So the weak didn't survive before when food was not abundant, and now food is abundant, more of a survive into adulthood, where we have more time for these conditions to manifest. So that's one of the biggest contributors. When I did my first biomedical science degree, we got taught about the hygiene hypothesis, and we're all too clean these days. We eat too much clean, hyper-processed foods and not enough dirty food straight from the garden. Turns out that was way oversimplified, and it definitely doesn't explain what we're seeing in these increased rates. So, you know, there are definitely things that would link in terms of the asthma space. There's great research going on right now in terms of a low fiber diet being kind of a highly inflammatory diet, and that increasing risk and symptoms in people with asthma. And so using fiber and high fiber foods, a good healthy diet we should all be eating anyway, most of us don't eat enough fiber, and using that as an intervention to reduce asthma risk and symptoms. So there's those kinds of links, is that where we're probably not eating as nutritiously as we should. The links to the gut bugs and the whole gut everything else axis, the anti-inflammatory properties of having a healthy gut microbiome. The problem is we don't really know yet what that is and how we can really properly induce that in people, other than saying eat a healthy balanced diet, high in fiber, high in whole grains, high in fruits and veg.
The advice really doesn't change that much, does it?
Yeah, sorry.
I mean, I guess it's good because it means that that's good advice.
Well, everyone wants a silver bullet, but you know, the human body is complex, and we have we have evolved eating a complex range of foods, and the best choice is never going to be something that comes in a bottle calling itself a superfood or a panacea.
That's really good. Someone else has asked a question here, which I think is interesting. Panel, I've lost it. Where did it go? What does the panel think about incorporating Australian Aboriginal food items? Would it be feasible and or sustainable? Has anyone got any thoughts on that?
I definitely would love to see more of that. I've been to a few workshops on Aboriginal medicine, and one of the things I appreciate sort of coming to Australia is the fact that I can just get kangaroo at the grocery store. Something that I cannot do back in the States or in Asia. So I do appreciate that. And I'm always fascinated to learn more about bush foods so I come from the Pacific Northwest, and, you know, I engage in a lot of foraging as well. So this is about access to knowledge, right? There's a lot of sort of, you know, wild, plants out there that are actually incredibly nutritious, right? And they just grow in the wild and they're free. And so if you have knowledge, then you can sort of start gathering those plants, and you can sort of eat them. You can make teas out of them. So I actually continue to do that here, sort of educating myself in terms of, you know, the native plants around here. So yeah, I would love to see more of the incorporation of that.
I think it's a great question and a great comment, but I think we need to be careful when we do it, not to do it in a white-centered fashion. It can't be one more way that we rape this country. It needs to be done with an Indigenous-centered purpose and Indigenous-centered enterprises. And that is a little bit of a problem when we see white businesses trying to use the Indigenous foods as a way to leverage their healthful properties without the social license to do so. And I think we also need to be careful not to other Indigenous foods. I saw an Indigenous friend on Twitter recently say, they're not bush foods, they're not Indigenous foods, they're just foods. Your foods don't get to be called foods while our foods get special names. And I think that is a really, really good point. So I think we need to be careful in how we approach it, and approach it in a way that engages the communities that hold that knowledge rather than just trying to take it from them.
We don't need it to be yet another exploitation, do we? And I've just got here a message from the ACT Science Week Committee. On Friday night, there was a panel on Indigenous food and agriculture. And if you check out there's a Royal Society of Victoria Facebook page, and the recording will be up soon on that. Oh, there it is. There's the link in the chat for everyone. So it talks about just that, exactly all those issues, as far as I know. They can tell me if I'm wrong, because I didn't see it. Okay, all right. I've got a question here for you, Emma, but I think we might have already touched on that, about that sort of idea of demand for, and Tar, you touched on that as well, the demand for fresh, tasty, healthy food, you know, and less undesirable, you know, saturated fats or sugar or whatever it is, lactose, gluten. But supplying those sorts of foods puts increased pressure on traditional farming, habitat clearing, and the road miles, you know, the amount of carbon that we're now emitting to get the food, those sorts of foods to. What are some of the innovations, and anyone can answer this, that the food industry is responding to consumers to provide healthy food but in a sustainable way? What sorts of things the food producers coming up with to be able to do that?
My answer on this is probably really counterintuitive. So we hear a lot these days about packaging and how we want less packaging on food, and packaging is a big part of waste and the problem. But what people tend not to realise is that packaging often is designed to prolong shelf life. And if you balance out the extension of shelf life versus the environmental cost of packaging, you can often be doing more benefit by using the packaging. So we look at things like our bagged lettuce in the supermarket, and people might think, well, that's, you know, why does lettuce need to come in a bag? But those bags are actually specially designed to change the way the gases are exchanged. That means the lettuce lasts longer and stays more nutritious at the same time. So what we really need to look at is not getting rid of all the packaging and going, well, we don't need this skin on the cucumber in the supermarket, it's already got its own skin. That covering is actually doing a job to make it last longer, which means it can be more sustainable. So designing proper packaging that can have those helpful properties without having the environmental impact is what we want to be aiming for, not just demonizing packaging altogether. So probably very counterintuitive to what people think we're going for in reducing waste, but doing things like making packaging out of waste. You can use the, you know, the waste product from manufacturing other foods to actually do things like, you know, make the bioplastics and things like that. So doing it smarter and not just kind of responding to those trigger points, because that's what we often do in the food industry. People hate packaging, let's get rid of it. Doesn't matter if it's actually making things more sustainable or not, as long as they think we're doing better, that's cool. We took wax off apples because people thought wax on apples was unnatural. We now waste a quarter of our apple crop in Australia because that wax was there to make them last longer and be more nutritious for longer. It wasn't there to trick you into thinking your apples were fresher and shinier. So really looking into what these things are doing before we, you know, have the arguments about what we should get rid of, I think is what the general public should be doing, rather than just simple logicking our way to those solutions.
That's really interesting, because I'm like, oh, why have they got plastic bags around lettuce? But, you know, obviously they're there for a reason, not just to, you know.
It's not just to unit it up and put advertising on and make it easier to stack on shelves. It's actually there to make that lettuce last longer. So that
how can we communicate that better so that people can make better choices?
I think they should communicate it better. And it was the same with taking the wax off apples. There was a pushback to the major supermarkets in Australia. We don't want this wax on our apples. People just started this campaign saying we don't want this. Instead of making an education campaign to say, actually, wax is safe, actually this wax is natural, actually it's there for an environmental purpose, they just went, well, people don't want it, now we'll run a campaign saying how great we are for taking it away. And that's not really useful, but it is, as Tar said, great marketing.
Okay, all right, so let's move on to health and well-being. And then there's we're seeing huge numbers of chronic, non-communicable, I mean, let's just set aside the big COVID for a second, chronic non-communicable diseases. So things like heart disease, things like type 2 diabetes, cancer, the #1 global killer, claiming more than 36 million lives every year. And similar in a similar vein to our discussion, many of those are in low and middle income countries. So the health is turning a big downturn in some of those countries as well. Emma, I know that you don't want to be asked what can I eat so I don't get fat, but poor diet and nutrition are generally associated with obesity. You are what you eat. You can't outrun a bad diet. As a molecular nutritionist, then, what would be the best things that we can do? Are you going to just tell me to eat? Are you going to give me the same answer?
I'll say real quick that we want to be careful with obesity. And I'm
interested in that.
Yeah. A lot of the research hasn't been done properly with linking obesity. One of the big things we find is obese people get a poorer quality of medical care. And there isn't really the research done to show how much of our poorer outcomes comes from the fact that if we go to the doctor and say, I've got this problem, and they go lose some weight, where if a skinny person comes in, they go and get an MRI. So obesity, difficult. But from the one thing you can do point of view, if I was going to say one thing that I wanted everyone to do to improve their diet, is just eat more vegetables. I don't care which vegetables, I don't care how they're prepared, I don't care where you get them from, I don't care what you're swapping them out for in your diet, just eat more vegetables. Vegetables have lots of fiber, they have lots of bioactive compounds, which are the bits in foods that aren't nutrients but do good things to our body. They've got lots of nutrients, the micronutrients, they're low in energy, low in saturated fats, all those things we want to eat less of. And just by eating them, whether we consciously think about swapping them for other things or not, they displace other foods from our diet by helping us feel fuller longer. So just eat more veg. I don't care how it happens. I don't care any of the details. I don't care if you put cheese on them, sauce on them, cream on them, whatever, just eat them.
I think, Emma, that's a very strong message there from Emma, eat more vegetables. Can I ask then, what about the people who go almost the other way? They go full carnivore, high fat, low carb. How can you reconcile those sort of two approaches? And they both have very good scientific evidence that they're making you healthier.
People love extremes. So people love to just go all in or all out. And if it's easy to go, this is my rules, that is easy to follow. Healthy, balanced diet, hard to follow because it sounds a little bit vague. And what does it mean? But if it's, I can't eat this and I definitely only eat that, super easy. And you see those macro effects. You see the weight loss because, of course, when you're restricting to just one food group or avoiding a whole food group, you see weight loss, which makes you think that things are working well. But remember, you can't see the molecular part of you, and just because you're losing weight doesn't mean it is actually a healthy diet. And I would caution people who are doing a low carb diet that carbs come in different shapes and sizes. There's high quality carbs, there's low quality carbs. So if you go low carb and cut out your high quality carbs, which fiber is a carb, if you cut fiber out, then you're actually increasing your risk of those conditions that we're trying to eliminate. And there's actually been a whole lot of really big studies, meta-analyses, the highest level of evidence when we're looking at
studies
showing that when people go low carb, they actually increase their risk of all of those conditions you just mentioned that they're actually trying to eliminate. And the hypothesis is it's because they're inadvertently going low fiber as well. So pick on quality, don't just group things together. Carb is not a food group, carb is a nutrient, and we are allowed some carbs. They are our major source of energy. They give us the energy we need to get through each day. So don't go extremes, even though I know from a personal point of view, they're so appealing. They are not what we want to be doing. The thing that all the good diets in the world have in common, Mediterranean, Okinawan, Blue Zone, whatever, is variety. They're all high variety diets.
I like the high variety.
Sorry, I got ranty again.
That's okay. All right. I'm just looking at the time, and it is 7:30, which is our hour. I told you that'd go quickly. I reckon we could sit here for at least another hour and chat. I'm going to ask you for final thoughts on our future of food. What is the one thing that you think is important when we consider the future of our food, Tar?
Actually, you know, I was thinking, you know, while Emma was sort of discussing, you know, nutrients and food and such, I was thinking back to this this food historian that I use in my food class, Jeffrey Pilcher, and he has this great line where he says, "In today's world, only the rich can afford to eat like peasants." And I think that's a really good line, right? In today's world, only the rich can afford to eat like peasants. And basically what he was getting at is what Emma is talking about, right? I mean, sort of, you know, basically whole foods, foods that are not adulterated, they're not mass manufactured, right? There's a whole variety of foods that, you know, these, that they were growing themselves, etc. You know, so unfortunately, you know, we live in this world where, you know, you have these disparities, and yeah, so the rich have access to a lot of options, right? They can eat like peasants, you know, or they can eat highly processed foods. And unfortunately, you know, because, you know, we are saturated with industrialized food, unfortunately, a lot of people in, you know, in marginalized places, all they have access to is, you know, these mass-produced foods. I mean, there's regions of the world, for example, in my food class, I talk about this, where, you know, soda is cheaper than water. Now, how do you get that kind of, you know, result, right? Where soda is cheaper than water. So, you know, so these, we have, I think, in terms of the future of food, sort of taking you know, a perspective where we understand that not everyone, again, has the access, has the knowledge, and there's a lot of inequity. And so just being aware of the privilege that we can even discuss these topics.
TJ, what's the most important thing we need to look out for heading into our food future?
One thing that we haven't discussed today at all is how we got into this situation. And the situation that we're in is that we've got too many people in the world.
Mm.
Someone
did mention that in the comments, and they were coming pretty thick and fast there for a while, but yeah.
But it is, you know, an issue for us. That's why it's so difficult for us. We have to feed, you know, I think we really do feel morally obligated to feed people that we have, but doing that within the environmental constraints that we have, that we're all starting to realize that we have too, is, you know, a huge issue. So that, for me, the big issue for the future is how do we keep population at a reasonable level. Mm. Population will probably start to decline, but that's not going to happen for probably another, you know, 70 or 80 years or more. So we've got a lot of feeding to do in the meantime. But we should be paying attention to population as well. We should have been paying attention to population over the last 50 years, of course. And some people did, but clearly it got out of control. Hmm. So Emma, think about population.
Emma, future of food, what is it?
Well, I think I would marry together what both Tar and TJ have just said, in that we need to remember the solutions for the future of food won't just come from personal choices. It doesn't, it's not, we're not going to make those big changes by all of us just eating healthy, balanced diets and, you know, choosing more variety and all of those things. The solutions have to come from a systemic level. And I think that's very difficult to do in the context of a growth economy, where we do always need to keep replacing people and having more people to look after us as we live older, longer lives, and we have an aging population. So these solutions do need to come from a systemic level. They do need to come in funding more research onto how we can do these things better. And it does take governments to take control and fund these solutions. As much as it's great that people make individually good choices, that can't be the solution on its own.
I'd like to thank all of you very much for our really interesting discussion. I'm sure we could actually sit here for quite a lot longer and delve into all of those. And we've got a couple of people saying thank you very much.